Good morning, Dawg Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We got some interesting stuff for you in the program today. One analyst makes, I think, a pretty interesting confession about Georgia, and we'll back that confession up with some facts. Also, Carson Beck here in the spotlight again as we move towards the start of the season. We'll tell you why that's true here today and what that could mean for the Dogs here this season. Also, Jon Stinchcomb stops by. And I've got a couple of interesting questions I want to ask today about the situation around Georgia in the playoff chase. In fact, even outside of the SEC. So we're going to get ready to do that and have a lot of fun with you here today. For those of you that had Father's Day yesterday, either celebrating your dad or being a dad that was being celebrated, I hope that went great for all of you. And we're certainly happy as we begin a brand new week to have you with us here today. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
One of the most prominent analysts out there in the college football world right now has made what I believe is a little bit of an interesting confession about Georgia. Now, confession sort of makes it sound more scandalous than it is, and that's not the case. But it is one of those things where someone who kind of lives outside of our bubble here at DawgNation is acknowledging something that I think we would say that we've seen with our own eyes. And I do think this sets us up for a point that is just at least worth noticing. I don't know that we're necessarily going to get too, bothered by this one way or another, but it's at least worth noticing. And then you sort of turn this into kind of a regular on-the-field football conversation about Georgia. So that's what I want to do here for a couple of minutes. Let me start with Greg McElroy. You know him, former Bama quarterback, now ESPN analyst. McElroy's got a couple of different media jobs. One of them is a podcast for ESPN. I believe it's called Always College Football. And on a recent episode of that program, McElroy made an interesting admission about Georgia, that he and some of his media colleagues are perhaps not talking enough right now about Georgia, and maybe some of the attention that should be going the way of UGA is going to a couple of other college programs. Now, he went on about this for a few minutes. Obviously, we can't play all of that, but I want to give you a little bit of a snippet here that I think does a pretty good job of kind of encapsulating everything that McElroy had to say about the fact that the two-time national champs and a program working on 3 straight undefeated regular seasons is somehow this offseason being overlooked. These aren't my words. This is Greg McElroy. This is what he recently said.
So when we start with the Georgia Bulldogs, you'll understand I still think that universally speaking, people have Georgia at worst the number 2 team in college football coming into the season. But how much time? Seriously, I've looked back through my notes. I've looked back through our shows that we've done, and we've talked way less about the Georgia Bulldogs this year compared to where they were the year before and the year before that. Way less. Now, why is that? Well, partly because Alabama had a coaching change. Partly because Georgia's just kind of a plug and play. They got so many pieces back. There's not a ton of question marks. They don't have a crazy quarterback competition going on right now. You kind of know that Georgia's going to be in the mix. And the other team that would be right alongside them in the mix at the top of the college football rankings this summer is Ohio State. And Ohio State has had such a tremendous offseason.
So there you go. It sounds like something you might expect someone like me to say. Boy, people are talking too much about Ohio State, maybe too much about Alabama. They're not talking nearly enough about Georgia right now. That's the kind of thing you would expect someone like me to say. But instead of me saying that, that's the ESPN analyst Greg McElroy saying that. And he's saying that because, we've sort of figured out what Georgia is. But, man, look at Ohio State. And the phrase that McElroy uses is, man, they've had such a tremendous offseason. Now, I guess it's up for some debate how tremendous an offseason can be. You can have a tremendous season, but a tremendous offseason, the sort of thing that the media seems to want to invent to have something to talk about. And I do agree with McElroy here. that there has been a little bit less talk about Georgia than you might imagine for a team that's got such a track record of success, and a lot of that has come at the expense of Ohio State that is being praised and so much, people being so impressed and falling all over themselves because of this so-called tremendous off-season that Ohio State has had. And I'm not telling you to be mad about it, because in life I think that, avoiding anger when you can is probably a pretty good thing to do. But I do think we should notice it. I mean, Greg McElroy notices, and he's talking about it out loud. If he, a non-Georgia guy, if he's okay to do that, I think, we are well within our rights to just sort of notice it too, that, man, there seems to be a lot of interest about Ohio State right now because of its so-called tremendous offseason, and some of that coming at the expense of talking about Georgia, who may be on its way back to winning a national championship once again. And if you're skeptical of what McElroy's saying there, that somehow this offseason is being viewed through kind of what I would describe as an Ohio State-centric lens. In other words, this offseason is being viewed through the lens of Ohio State and kind of the referendum supposedly on them to win a national championship right now after hated rival Michigan did that, and Ohio State's kind of become a little bit of a kind of a non-factor in the national championship picture, as of late. If you don't believe Greg McElroy, when McElroy says that this current offseason is kind of being viewed through the lens of a program like Ohio State, let me give you an example of this. There was a story at CBS Sports. I'm going to read you a little bit of this here in a moment. A story at CBS Sports the other day that actually told the tale of why maybe Georgia ought to be viewed as the favorite to win this year's national championship. In fact, even over a program like Ohio State, if we take the stat that CBS gave us seriously, and yet the headline doesn't say that at all. Now, keep in mind here, the story is about something that Georgia has going for it that continues a recent trend for national champions. But I want to show you the headline here. If you're watching on video, I'll show this to you, and I'll read a little bit of this to you. So Greg McElroy says, we as a media aren't talking nearly enough about Georgia right now. We're talking, a lot about Ohio State. Here's an example. Headline at CBSSports.com. Ohio State must buck history in title pursuit. The subhead says the past 10 national champs have all boasted a level of core continuity that Ohio State won't have. In the story itself, and I'm going to read a little bit of this to you, Ohio State is number 2 in Dennis Dodd's post-spring top 25. This is David Cobb, the writer, widely expected to compete for a national championship during a critical 7th season for Coach Ryan Day. The Buckeyes loaded up on transfer talent, made a splashy offensive coordinator hire in Chip Kelly to bolster a program that's gone 129-16 over the past 12 seasons. Cobb goes on to write, but if the Buckeyes are going to hoist the trophy on January 20th, 2025 at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, they will be required to break recent continuity norms for title-winning teams. Cobb says this is an interesting stat. College football's last 10 national champions, dating back to the beginning of the college football playoff era, have each returned at least 3 of the following 4. Head coach, offensive and defensive coordinator, and a quarterback who started at least 4 games in the prior year. For this upcoming year, Ohio State brings back the same head coach, the same defensive coordinator, Jim Knowles, but obviously it's a brand new offensive coordinator in Chip Kelly, and they do not have that level of continuity at starting quarterback. Now, when you read on throughout the story, first of all, it's interesting. Not only did all of this occur during the entirety of the college football playoff era the last 10 years, but dating back to the start of the BCS era, which was 1998, there have only been 3 national champions that didn't bring back at least 3 of the 4, head coach, 2 coordinators, and returning starter quarterbacks. So that's kind of an interesting trend in and of itself. But when you read even deeper in the story, what you find out, something that Georgia fans already know, that Georgia brings back all 4. They have continuity at head coach, of course, in Kirby Smart. Mike Bobo is back as offensive coordinator. Glenn Schumann's back as defensive coordinator. And, of course, Carson Beck is returning at quarterback. A year ago, they didn't have that. Mike Bobo was a first-year OC, at least in this particular stint, and Carson Beck was a first-year starter quarterback. So last year, Georgia didn't have what CBS itself would describe as the kind of national championship continuity needed to win, but this year it does. So to go back to Greg McElroy's point here for a minute, you could have titled this story, Trends Suggest Georgia Could Be Back in National Championship Form, which is kind of how we've titled our show here today. Obviously, we do a Georgia-centric show. But for some reason, CBS frames this story around what Ohio State doesn't have as opposed to what Georgia does have, because as Greg McElroy says, this is an offseason when there's a lot more folks enamored by Ohio State than they are with Georgia for one reason or another. Now, once again, I don't expect you to necessarily be mad about that, but I think we are within our rights to notice that even when a trend says something good about Georgia and perhaps not so good about Ohio State, the headline from a national website still sort of frames it from an Ohio State point of view. Like, why is that? That just seems a little bit weird. Once again, perhaps not something to be, outraged by, but observing it, paying attention to it, recognizing it. I think we are all within our rights to do that, especially if Greg McElroy is sort of doing the same thing. But no matter what may be going on in terms of the fascination with Ohio State, let me frame this now in a slightly different way. I don't know that I was fully aware of the CBS Sports trend they put out there about the value in continuity, at least based on the circumstantial evidence of all 10 college football playoff national champions had at least 3 of those 4 returning coordinators, returning head coach, and at least some starting experience at quarterback, and all but 3 of the champions in the college football playoff plus BCS era had the same thing going for them there as well. I don't think I was aware of just how continuous that trend had reemerged in college football. And I think it does say something good about Georgia that, once again, they were able to hold on to Glenn Schumann. We've talked about Schumann a lot as of late, dating back to the Zayden Walker commitment the other day. The fact that Schumann hasn't taken an NFL defensive coordinator job or hasn't taken a college football head coaching job, 2 things that he's been rumored for, the fact that Georgia's been able to hold on to him, I think is a pretty big deal. And Mike Bobo, who was not universally celebrated when he was hired last year as the replacement for Todd Monken, based on the overall offensive results for Georgia this past season, the fact that Bobo returns, I think, is also a pretty big deal, too. Obviously, Kirby Smart, we know how important that is. But once again, Carson Beck stepping back for Georgia when he likely could have gone to the NFL and been a pretty good draft pick, perhaps even a first-round pick. The fact that he's coming back for Georgia, once again, is a very big deal. And to accentuate just how true this might be, this is one of my favorite times of year in the fact that we are now in college football preseason magazine season. And obviously in this digital age, the printed magazines don't have the same importance they once did, especially when these things go to the newsstand so early, or I should say the printers so early that, kind of late-breaking transfer portal stuff, things like that. Maybe some of this stuff doesn't always kind of get into these magazines. Obviously, that's the issue, but I will always kind of love this just because I'm nostalgic for, having grown up doing this kind of thing. So I still like the preseason magazines, and I bought the Lindy's magazine yesterday. I'll get the Athlon eventually, and some of the stuff I want to do on the show the next couple of days is sort of related to the Lindy's magazine and just kind of liking that and some of the things that come up there. And many of you know this from throughout the years. One of the things that I love most about these preseason magazines is when you get the quotes from the anonymous coaches. I just love that. I love the candor that comes from anonymity. And there are a couple of things that the Lindy's magazine had about Georgia that I want to highlight here today. One thing in particular here right now, I've got a little blurb from the magazine here. And by the way, you should go to newsstands, buy this for yourself. I don't know. I mean, this is not an ad. They don't pay us money. But I'd say, college magazines are kind of a fun thing. So if you want to support the people who print those, probably a good thing to do. But that's up for you to decide. Anyway, I want to read one thing here that an opposing coach said about Georgia in light of what we were just talking about, the value of continuity with your coaching staff, bringing back your coordinators, for instance, being a predictor for who wins the national championship. One of the things this opposing coach says about Georgia in the Lindy's preseason magazine says, Kirby Smart, I always say, this is what the guy says. Speaking of Kirby Smart, I always say a team takes on the identity of their head coach, and he's tough and relentless. This is an anonymous coach, Lindy's magazine. He's tough and relentless on details. You see that on film. I love this. This is interesting. He says they're going to recruit their tails off and out-tough you, and on top of that, they're going to put you in those disadvantaged spots. They do a great job. That's what an opposing coach says there about Kirby Smart and the Georgia coaching staff in the Lindy's preseason magazine. Now, let me tell you why I think this is interesting. Because a couple of things that opposing coach says there, we know just how true that is. Of course, Georgia out-recruits almost everybody. And, of course, they instill a culture of toughness, and they work to cultivate that as much as possible. But that's not the only thing that opposing coach said there in the Lindy's preseason magazine. He also says the Georgia coaching staff finds a way to get the opposition into what was described as disadvantaged spots. In other words, where we're strong and where you're weak, we're to make sure we highlight those opportunities as much as we can during a game. That's what both Mike Bobo and Glenn Schumann apparently do well, according to a guy that Lindy's magazine says has faced them on the field. And we don't often give Georgia that kind of credit. We talk about the talent, we talk about the toughness, but the actual schematic advantage that this coach says he sees from Georgia, that's perhaps where we don't always give the Dogs enough credit. So let's tie all this together here for a moment. CBS Sports says that bringing back your coordinators, along with continuity at starting quarterback and with your head coach, has been one of the big predictors for who wins a national championship. Well, Georgia checks all 4 of those boxes here this season. And I don't think that's just sort of an empty anomaly. I don't think that's a trivial footnote. I think it's probably pretty important because of the phrase that this opposing coach uses, that Georgia's coaching staff has found a way to get its opposition into disadvantaged situations. In other words, they take their tough, talented players and they put them into a favorable position on the field during games. That's what the Georgia coaching staff has been able to do. And Georgia brings back that coaching staff here this season. That's one of the main reasons why we think that Georgia could very well be well on its way to another national championship again here in 2024. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We're very happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us, across video platforms, 10 a.m., radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, everything else. We just really appreciate you being a part of the program. And by the way, if you're watching on YouTube right now, would you do me one simple favor? If you do truly like the show, would you mind giving us a like? You know, I don't fully understand how all this works, but the big tech folks, they seem to, they like to kind of like promote things that they see doing well online. Obviously, our show gets a lot of views, which we're very thankful for. But to get even more views and get a bigger audience, so sometimes that like button really helps us with that. So if you do like the show, obviously if you don't like the show, you don't have to lie about it. But if you do like the show, you want to click that like button for us, boy, what a great thing that would be for you to be able to do. We would certainly appreciate that here today. And by the way, big thanks to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia who make all of this possible today. Energy efficient windows and doors. That is what Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about. It's that really hot time of year, and especially like for me, it's the upstairs part of your house. You've got a lot of windows upstairs. That sunshine comes in. It sort of feels like the air conditioning unit this time of year is sort of working overdrive to kind of keep your house cool. Well, that's where energy efficient windows and doors like what Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about. That's where they can step up and help you. They have sort of those built-in shades sometimes in the windows. So if you want to kind of block some of the sunlight that's coming in, or if you want to, just have properly sealed windows that kind of keep the energy on the inside of your house this time of year, that's the air conditioning where it's supposed to be. That's what Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about. You can also get great savings right now there as well. You've heard us talk about this so much. We'll take advantage of the great offer from Pella now too, because between now and the end of the month, that's June 30th, you can get 15% off a Pella project or special financing there as well. Stop by and see them in their Experience Center in Duluth to find out more about this. Invite them to come out to your home, kind of see your space, and talk about how exactly their product could fit into your space. Do it virtually if you'd like to. Just make sure you tell them that BA at DawgNation Daily said they'd take good care of you, because for years, that's what they've been doing for folks in our audience. So let me give you the number so you can give a call, 678-638-1429. One more time, 678-638-1429, or PellaofGA.com/DawgNation. That's PellaofGA.com/DawgNation. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. Another guy that we think is viewed to be the best, at least for us, that's the former Georgia All-American Jon Stinchcomb. He'll join us later on. Fun conversation with him. We have a follow-up, an important follow-up on a former Georgia staffer today, and I think it's important we tell this story. We'll do that. A little bit of an update as it relates to Georgia recruiting. We'll kind of get to that there a little bit too. But before any of that, let's get ready to go around the doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And, one of the things we've been talking about here a little bit is, as I mentioned before, that Lindy's preseason magazine, what the opposing coaches have said about Georgia. I like to do that kind of thing this time of year. And there was something pretty interesting about Carson Beck in there that I wanted to kind of highlight here. Obviously, Beck is going to get a lot of attention because, as CBS pointed out, bringing back that experience at quarterback, one of the most important facets in national championship teams during the college football playoff era. Georgia's obviously, lucky to be able to bring back Carson Beck here this year. And as you might imagine, opposing coaches sort of sounding off on Carson Beck in the Lindy's preseason magazine, what he does well. Let me go back to the screenshot that I showed you before and now read a little bit about Carson Beck. This is an opposing coach on him. That Carson Beck was extremely accurate when we played them. He was very comfortable operating in their system. He didn't make any mistakes, and you can tell that he's a field general who sees everything around him. That is what this opposing coach says that he has seen from Carson Beck. And actually, to our folks back there, to Cody and Danny and these guys, Jon Stinchcomb says he doesn't have a link to join us, so we can send that to him. Maybe we'll make sure he's good to go and ready to go here. John says he does not have a link. But anyway, so Carson Beck is one of those guys that's being praised here by this opposing coach in the Lindy's magazine as a field general who sees everything around him. And it's kind of interesting that it seems like the Georgia coaches perhaps have kind of noticed that too. In fact, there was one point during the offseason where, Kirby Smart sort of alluded to the fact that maybe they sort of wish, because of the comfort they learned that Beck had in their system, because of how accurate he was operating this Georgia offense, that maybe they should have turned him loose a little bit more, perhaps early in the season when he was just kind of getting started as the Georgia starting quarterback, but perhaps ahead of the pace from where Georgia maybe thought that he was. At one point in time during this offseason, Kirby got kind of candid about that a little bit, about kind of letting him go. What was the phrase? Let the cat go or let the cat play or whatever that phrase was. Kirby Smart did talk about that a little bit a couple of months ago. This is what Kirby said about that at the time.
Well, your offense can only be as aggressive as the players around him. It's not all on the quarterback. And when I say that about let the cat go play, that really came more from Mike and the offensive staff in terms of allowing him to play and play to his strengths. His strengths are his ability to navigate the pocket, to make throws, to change plays, and to put us in the right play. That's his greatest strengths, and to use the weapons around him. So I think he'll continue to do that. He's done that thus far. He makes you right a lot. He's very hard to trick and confuse. And when you've got a player like that, as long as he has weapons around him, he can distribute the ball. And our offense has a lot of ways, which you guys have seen in the past. We have a large volume of catchers, meaning it spreads out. We don't necessarily have one guy with 150, but we got a bunch of guys with a lot of touches. And the reason we can do that is the decision making that Carson has and the experience he has. So I'm excited to see him go play. Keeping him healthy and protected is important, but also surrounding him with playmakers that can capitalize on his strengths will make us a better offense.
Let me try to sum up a lot in a little here and kind of tell you where all of this lands with me, what this opposing coach says in Lindy's, what Kirby Smart says there. There was a thing the other day on ESPN.com kind of looking at back from the standpoint of a draft prospect. And the stuff that ESPN in this particular story said that Beck does well is the same stuff that Kirby says there and the same stuff that Lindy's said too. That within the confines of the offense, Beck is very comfortable and he operates very smoothly in that. And, in any kind of draft prospect situation, you're going to have a plus and a minus, a positive and negative. The one thing that Beck, they said, perhaps needs to work on a little bit more is what he does kind of outside the boundaries of the offense. I sort of took it to mean when a play breaks down, how do you kind of either use your legs or something like that to kind of make something happen? The ESPN draft story said that Beck could perhaps be a little bit better at that. And what that led me to believe is that if that's true, this is what Carson Beck's really good at, this is where Carson Beck, perhaps could see some improvement, then in a lot of ways, doesn't that make him almost the exact opposite quarterback of his predecessor, Stetson Bennett? Now, Bennett, I think, goes down as an all-time great, but I don't know that Bennett knew the offense as well as Carson Beck does. And throughout the entirety of the game, I don't know that Bennett was capable of operating as smoothly as Carson Beck sometimes seems like he operates. Man, Stetson was good when things broke down, or it was time to kind of like just sort of improvise late in the game. Man, Stetson always seemed to have that moxie. Beck is just a little bit different. Now, I don't know that one guy is necessarily obviously better or not than the other. I think that the season for Carson this season is going to go a long way towards telling us that. But I do believe it could look different. You know, the best moments for Bennett always came late in the game. 2 fourth-quarter touchdowns against Alabama. The comeback against Ohio State. The late-game moments for Bennett are really the thing we remember him for. But for Carson, it may also just kind of be the opposite of that. It may be early in the game, on early downs, and perhaps also early in the season, something that last year Georgia didn't quite turn him loose to do. That if he knows the offense so well, if he operates so smoothly within the confines of that offense, then turn that up early in the game and on early downs to sort of establish a level of dominance that makes everything else easier after that. In other words, it could be this year that we see a quarterback performance for Georgia by Carson Beck that looks far different than anything that Stetson Bennett put together. But hopefully the end result is the same. A Heisman finalist, a national champion, and a guy that's going to get plenty of attention as we head towards the 2025 NFL Draft. And that is Around the Doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And last night, I sat on the couch all day long watching the U.S. Open and just kind of enjoying that. It was hot. Wasn't loving the idea of being outside. But finally, I felt like I'd just been sitting around the couch so long that now I got to get out and just go do something. I got to move around a little bit. So I walked around the neighborhood a couple times, just try to get some steps in. And when I got home, I was thirsty, right? And so I sat down on the couch and I popped open, for me, it was a can of Diet Dr. Pepper. And I sat there and kind of nighttime after walking around a bunch, so I felt like I really earned a little treat. And the Diet Dr. Pepper was great for me there on that. But for a lot of you this summer, it's also the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut and the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar because, Dr. Pepper's always introducing these brand new flavors and these really fun new options. It's a great summer for Dr. Pepper for that very reason. So if you haven't tried the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut or the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar, this is a great time for you to do that. So when you're shopping at your local Kroger or wherever you're doing your grocery shopping, pick some up today, and you can be just as happy as I was last night. Enjoying a little Dr. Pepper on a summer night, so tasty and enjoyable after a really fun day of watching golf and everything else that was going on here for this particular Father's Day. Good to have Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut, and Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar bringing Around the Doghouse to us here today. All right, as I told you before, a little bit of an update on UGA recruiting before we're done today, and a very important update on a former Georgia staffer who's doing some very important things. We'll give all of that to you here coming up in just a little bit. But for now, on everything going on around Georgia, including some of the stuff we've already discussed here today, let's bring on the great former Georgia All-American. It's Jon Stinchcomb here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let me bring in Jon Stinchcomb here for a moment. John, it's always great to have you, and I hope you had a wonderful Father's Day with your family yesterday. I trust that you were treated well. We were just talking about Carson Beck a little bit, and the point that I made is if you look at what either opposing coaches or draft analysts, even Kirby Smart himself, saying about Beck, right now it sort of looks like that in a lot of ways he may be almost the precise opposite of Stetson Bennett, whereas I don't know that Bennett ever knew the offense as well as Carson Beck does now, and perhaps he didn't quite have the ability to kind of crank it up and throw it on a down-to-down basis the way that Carson does. But, man, he was always magical in these sort of late heroic moments where you really needed somebody to improvise and make a play. Bennett was always just so good at that, and some people say that's maybe an area where Carson Beck could sort of show some improvement, that he can kind of make plays outside the boundaries of the offense from time to time. Do you kind of agree with the premise here that, two guys who have a chance to both be very successful seem to, in a lot of ways, just be almost, whether it's the exact opposite or at least very different in how they go about their business, comparing Stetson Bennett and Carson Beck?
Yeah, I don't think that they're exact opposites, but you do look at their strengths, their ultimate, peak points as their character profile develops. And Carson, I heard the rundown of what he does well. I couldn't agree more. I think, if anything, it was those open throws for, the shot plays that were created where he missed more than what he did during creation of off-schedule plays that kind of stuck out to me for areas of improvement. I thought there were times where Carson did scramble outside of the pocket and did get first downs with his legs. Not nearly as frequently or as proficiently as Stetson did, but certainly is capable. He seems like a guy that, obviously feels more comfortable in the pocket, but was able to create given those opportunities. I've seen other players that just don't have that capability. I think Carson does. It's just not his first go-to. So I think the contrast breakdown it breaks down a little bit when you get to that point of his off-schedule plays. I don't think that's a weakness for him. I don't think that it's his leading characteristic, probably like it is for Stetson, but it certainly isn't, one of those guys where he's a, wooden Indian who's just a statue in the pocket and can't get out and can't make plays off schedule. It's just not his leading characteristic like it was for Stetson.
Kind of on this same theme, I was doing a radio interview the other day, and I was talking about how I think one of the things that makes this year's Georgia team different, at least in terms of perception right now, than any of the others that have kind of come before it in what I think of as the national championship era for Georgia. I think one of the things that makes this different is this team, by perception, is a lot more quarterback-led than any of those other Georgia teams were. Even, by the way, in 2022, when Stetson was coming back as a quarterback that had won a national championship the previous year, I still don't think we were talking about Stetson the way that we're talking about Carson right now, where, as Carson goes, I would say, to a large degree, so go the fortunes here of Georgia. He's got the responsibility of helping cultivate a replacement for Brock Bowers and kind of integrate a lot of other somewhat newish offensive talent into the picture. And I don't know that people were putting that responsibility solely on Stetson in 2022, in part because we had just seen Georgia be a historically good defense the previous year. How about that, in terms of, a spotlight around Beck that I don't know that any Georgia quarterback has ever had to begin a season. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you have to go back to the days of like a Matthew Stafford or even Aaron Murray that, the expectation was their ceiling is so high that we can run a bigger portion of the offense through them. And I think that's realistic. I think a part of it has to do with what's around them. First, Carson is an incredibly talented quarterback who very easily could have been drafted pretty high this past year. So for him to come back, it is a boon to the offense to have a player of his capability returning and still with area of improvement that can only make this offense better. I think another part of that storyline is that we don't return a stable of running backs like what we had in Stetson's second year as a starter. And that's got more to do with just the uncertainty of the room, not the level of talent. We just haven't seen them perform. They haven't had those opportunities. Lots of incoming freshmen. Obviously, Robinson's coming back from an injury, and another Robinson who might have more opportunity. So the talent is there. It's just not as proven as it has been in years past. And you couple that with the amount of talent that we have in the receiving room. We have, in my opinion, the best group of wide receivers that Georgia has ever seen from top to bottom. Sure, we've had better, possibly better individual talent, but as an overall group, that room is stacked. So there is more opportunity for Georgia to attack defenses through the air, and that centers around your quarterback. And our quarterback is very capable in the pocket. And, like it was said so many times before I even came on the show today, one of the main skills that he brings is getting the offense in the right position, in the right play, and going through his reads and getting the ball to where it needs to go. All those things dovetail really well when you look at the roster that's surrounding Carson Beck.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Something else we also talked about before you joined us was a stat that CBS gave us, which is in the college football playoff era, all 10 national champs had at least some experience returning at quarterback, or I should say 3 of these 4 characteristics: some experience returning at quarterback, returning head coach, and returning offensive and defensive coordinators. That every champ in the playoff area had at least 3 of those 4 boxes checked off. Georgia for the upcoming season has all 4. Now, no trend proves definitively anything because that's why the games are played. You have to see how it plays out, and all trends eventually, to a certain extent, come to an end. But this is one of those stats I sort of like because I think it makes sense. Obviously, maintaining that continuity, if you're able to do it, and champions often are not because, guys are moving on to the NFL or coaches are moving on to bigger jobs, whatever else. But if you can maintain that continuity, of course it seemingly would be a strength. So this is one of those stats that I like because it seems to match up with what I think we see with our own eyes, right?
I hope so. I hope that's the case. And I think you look at what Georgia is, how they're built, and obviously consistency with coaches and understanding culture, I think, is important. In this new era, my only hesitation is the amount of teams that have been able to build and establish through transfer portal, and that probably pertains more to basketball than football. But I think when you have, although a guy like Joe Burrow comes into town for LSU, and that's a different program because of him. I think if anything, you look at these championship teams, and they all have quarterbacks that can get the job done. I'm thinking of a CJ Stroud or a Bryce Young or a Joe Burrow, and I think Carson Beck coming back has that same capability of being one of those high-end, potential top 10 pick, if not top 5 pick quarterback in the NFL draft next year that can really have the team ride his shoulders through the season. And those guys that we just listed, they were surrounded by talent, as is Carson. And I think that's what makes those championship teams really good. I mean, obviously those 3 or 4 categories are important, but at the end of the day, you got to have the right horses. And I think Georgia certainly does this year, and specifically in the marquee position of quarterback. Makes a big difference when you've got a guy that you can trust him to come through in those big moments. I think Stetson was that guy for Georgia a few years ago, and Carson's that guy now.
Yeah, let me add one more point to this, and this is just more interesting than anything else, but if you want to go back to the end of the BCS era and sort of the start of the college football playoff era, there was a trend there for a while where it sort of seemed like quarterback experience didn't matter anymore. Johnny Manziel in 2012 won the Heisman Trophy as a first-year starter quarterback and as a kind of freshman player. Following year, Jameis Winston stepped in his first year at Florida State. Not only did he win the Heisman, they won the national championship. Cardell Jones in 2014 stepped in during the postseason as a former third-string quarterback, and he led Ohio State to the national championship that year. That we had this little stretch going for a while. And by the way, Georgia kind of has its own version of that with Jake Fromm stepping in as a true freshman in 2017. That we had this thing going on in college football for a while where it sort of seemed like experience at the quarterback position was completely overrated. But in the recent years, that trend sort of turned back the other way, where all of a sudden now bringing back some continuity at quarterback has really mattered. Like you mentioned Joe Burrow in 2019, obviously unbelievably successful year, but he'd also been the starter in 2018. Stetson Bennett had some experience for Georgia in 2020 before stepping in and leading them to a championship in 2021. That all of a sudden now the quarterback position, certainly more so than it was like a decade ago, has kind of become a veteran position once again. And I at least think that's interesting. And certainly it's potentially favorable for Georgia this year because of the experience that Carson Beck got last year.
Yeah, I think it comes down to this. You got to have talent in that position. And there's a lot of guys a lot of teams that might have a guy. I mentioned CJ Stroud. I know they didn't win any championships, and Georgia was the spoiler for them. But the reason why they were so capable is because of a truly exceptional quarterback. I think Carson can fall into that category. And I think you look at transcendent teams that are able to compete, and you have to have that box checked, whether it's experienced or not. The reason why Johnny Manziel was so fascinating to watch wasn't because of what he did on schedule, is that he was able to create. And you have to have a playmaker at that position to be a difference maker. You just listed through a number of guys that are very different. I think you look through the skill set of a Jameis Winston versus a Cardale Jones or a Johnny Manziel or Joe Burrow. That's a wide variety of ways that guys are getting the job done from that position, with the only commonality being they can create and are exceptional at what they do, and that's Carson. And I also would say this: they have talent surrounding them. I'm a believer at this point that there's only a handful of teams that have legitimate chances to win, and it's because not of the parity in the league, but because of the disparity in the league. That there's a handful of teams that have been able to collect and pool talent and develop talent in a way that gives them an opportunity to compete for championships. And Georgia is certainly in that realm, and is probably leading that realm for all teams when you look at it as a comparison.
We've talked about the Georgia schedule before. Last week, Jeff Lebby, the new Mississippi State coach, which admittedly is not a guy that's all that famous to a lot of people in our audience, perhaps, but he said something I thought was kind of interesting, that given just the nature of how tough these schedules are, he didn't mention Georgia by name, but he said, I don't know that I see anybody going undefeated in the SEC. And that was certainly my position to begin the calendar year, that, hey, I'm not quite so sure we live in an era of undefeated college football playoff national champions anymore, just given, how tough these schedules are and the fact the playoff is now longer than it used to be. Although as the months have kind of gone on, I do give Georgia more of a chance to go undefeated in the regular season than I once did. They're going to be a point spread favorite in every game. And, the only really, really narrow spread is going to be the game at Texas, perhaps. In other words, this is kind of, familiar ground for us. We've talked about this before, but now you've got an SEC coach weighing in to say that perhaps no one goes undefeated and the tough schedules create more parity. Do you think that Georgia's schedule is just simply too tough to go undefeated, or does Georgia have enough talent they can overcome what is perhaps a historically rugged grind?
Yeah, it's not too tough for them to go undefeated. I think they are very capable of going undefeated. They just don't need to. They don't have to. The game is we've continued to add games. You extend the playoffs. You're talking about teams that can play 16-plus games in a season. That's NFL length. And with the exception of the Dolphins 50 years ago, there's been a Super Bowl champion each year that has been able to hoist the trophy without having to go undefeated, and the same is going to hold true. Is Georgia capable? Yes, they are. Do they need to be? No, they don't. They need to, and I assume fully, based on what we've seen and the amount of talent that they have, that they're very capable of winning a national championship without going undefeated. I think it's more realistic now than it ever has been. I think you look at last season is probably the last season where you're saying, here is a supremely talented team that only lost one game to a worthy opponent and didn't have the chance to compete for a national championship in the playoff setting. And that's gone now. And Georgia they just don't need to.
So I want to finish with this, if you don't mind. Last week, we also got something interesting from Georgia Tech coach Brent Key, who was doing one of these sort of booster club deals. And, there's a lot of things that are sort of said in these environments that's not said other places. Maybe this is an example of that, but he talked very openly about his hatred for UGA. This is the kind of spice this rivalry hasn't had in a long time. John, any reaction to you from the fact that, at least for now, Brent Key seems intent on kind of turning the heat up on clean old-fashioned hate a bit?
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for him as a coach. I think he's done a great job with the program. I like the direction that Georgia Tech is heading. You're barking up the wrong tree, brother. That's not where your program is. That's not where you need to be. I don't think it's good for his base, or it's just not a great look overall. You may not like Georgia. You may not like the fact that they are nationally relevant and are the standard bearer for all of college sports. You're not there. You're not at that point where you've earned the opportunity to speak the way he did. And I don't like it. I don't think it's a good look for him. I don't think it's a good look for the program. Yeah, he may very well feel that way, but from where Georgia Tech is as a program, and they are building, and they're an arrow-up program, and there's a lot to be proud of for what he's done as a head coach in a short amount of time. They have not earned the right for him to speak the way he did about Georgia. And it went beyond, this is a rivalry. I mean, he said the entire program, there's nothing that he respects. He hates all of it. And I just I don't agree with that approach. I don't agree with what his take is. And, you haven't earned that. So a little bit of an issue there for me.
How do you think the Georgia fans should view Georgia Tech? Is this a rivalry that must be preserved at all cost, or as Georgia continues to ascend to great heights, that perhaps, Tech just has less relevance for Georgia than it used to? How do you think a UGA fan should view Tech overall?
Yeah, I think your last line is very accurate. It is not relevant anymore. I think you're talking about two different stratospheres, and it's different. When I played, I lost to Georgia Tech, and it wasn't too far distant that Georgia lost to Georgia Tech at home. But the game has changed. The entire geography of college football has changed, and it's no longer what it used to be. And I think there's a little piece of that Coach Key is still holding on to, of what it used to be. It's not that anymore. It's not what we experienced when he was a player or when I was a player. That rivalry has changed. The opportunities for both programs have changed. And you have to recognize those things. And I'm glad we still play that game. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I think it's kind of exciting that it's on Black Friday on a Friday night between in-state teams. But it is not this rivalry that he wants it to be, that, they're not equals. They're not peers. They're not on the same level.
No, I think that's well said, John, and I always love your candor on things like this. It's great to have you here. As I said before, I hope you had a wonderful Father's Day, and, of course, we love talking football with you, and we'll look forward to doing that again very soon here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
Always good to talk about them dogs. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs, John. Awesome.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So a very matter-of-fact statement from Jon Stinchcomb right there about what Tech isn't. And I don't think that Georgia fans are going to disagree with that at all. Very, very strong stuff indeed. Speaking of strong stuff, I believe this week is going to be a fun week in the life of DawgNation as we get ready to make a significant announcement. I'm very excited about it. Of course, if it's taking place in the space, I think it gives you a little bit of a hint of what it might be. But man, oh man, it's going to be a good when we get there. Really, really good stuff indeed. And by the way, with that in mind, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Of course, for me, only a few weeks away now from my chance to see for the very first time a cruise ship make its debut. That's Utopia of the Seas, the Oasis class ship. That's going to be so much fun. And when you see all the cool stuff that goes on here, you just sort of realize first of all, take a look at this if you're watching on video. So one of the things that Royal Caribbean does is it gets really creative with some of their suite spaces. Now, a suite is different than a regular stateroom. It's obviously, a little bit different kind of commitment, right? It's just a little bit different kind of thing. But, Royal Caribbean wants to sort of upgrade those opportunities, but also, create those chances to enjoy, whether it be Perfect Day Coco Cay or the water slides on board. There's just so many different ways to make this such a fun experience. Brand new restaurants, unlike anything we've ever seen before, like the Royal Railway, and of course, venerable staples like Chops Grill and Giovanni's Italian Kitchen and all that. Utopia of the Seas is just going to be incredible. So I'm going to get a chance to enjoy it in a couple of weeks. Can't wait to come back and tell all of you about it. But if you want to make plans for your own Royal Caribbean cruise vacation experience on board Utopia of the Seas or one of the other Royal Caribbean cruise ships, such as Icon of the Seas, which debuted in January, or anything else, Jessica Slater is the one to help you out with all of that. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her at jslater@dreamvacations.com. Make sure you check all of that out today. All right, so a couple of stories here, cruise around the SEC. A little bit quieter for us on the recruiting front today than the last couple of Mondays have been. Georgia did host visitors here this weekend. We'll look forward to getting more details from Jeff about how that went down. But not the big explosive headlines coming off this weekend the way it was recently. Maybe Father's Day has something to do with that. However, Georgia wide receiver target CJ Wiley did take his official visit to LSU this weekend. Obviously, you'd expect that went well. The online chatter suggests that it did. We also now have new details about when Wiley's going to make his commitment decision. June 25th is now expected to be the day. There are some online predictions favoring Georgia here right now. How serious are those? And do we see kind of an about face on that before we get to the 25th? I guess we'll have to find out. But this has long been framed as kind of a battle between LSU, where there's a strong family tie, Georgia, where there's the strong in-state tie, and the relationship that CJ has with Terrence Edwards, you would presume, kind of factors into all this too. This is one of those big recruitments, kind of a bellwether recruitment in some respects, because Georgia has really put itself out there when it comes to in-state talent at wide receiver, the wide receiver position in general. Wiley's one of those guys that I think a lot of people who follow this stuff very closely, report this for a living, are going to say has a chance to really climb the rankings before this cycle comes to a close. And on June 25th, major date. Is it Georgia LSU, and what kind of impression was LSU able to make this past weekend? These are going to be very, very provocative questions to ask ahead of next week when all of this goes down. So there you go. Wiley goes to LSU for a visit. Georgia expected to still be a major factor here, and we're only about a week away from CJ Wiley making, at least what's been reported, his commitment decision. So keep your eye on that. A couple of other notes here from men. I was thinking about this here today. One of my favorite things about the college football offseason is thinking about what's going to happen during the season and kind of expecting some trends that we typically see to perhaps re-emerge this upcoming year. And there are certain things that happen in almost every college football season that I think a lot of people don't quite realize how continuously this is true. Let me give you, for instance. Did you know that in most years, now I don't have the exact percentage or the exact stat, but in most years, a team that begins the year in the preseason top 10, at least one of those teams will finish the season unranked. That most years that occurs. It seems like one of those things that you wouldn't exactly expect to happen, because preseason top 10 teams are usually preseason top 10 for a reason. But of those 10, somebody usually ends up being a massive disappointment. For instance, last year, USC with Caleb Williams and all of that, he began the season, or the Trojans began the season, the preseason top 10, but by the end of the year, they weren't ranked at all. And that's just the kind of thing that you see more often than not. Somebody somewhere disappoints. So I think it gets really interesting to kind of look at the overall landscape and say, who's that team for this year? Who could that be here this year? And if we're looking nationally across the entire landscape, the answer for me, I would say, is easy, not in terms of I know that I'm right, but it's easy for me in terms of who I think it is right now. If this team does even end up being preseason top 10, there's a chance they will be. For me, I would look at Michigan here pretty closely. I would just look at a team that, you talk about continuity, loses head coach, loses defense coordinator, loses quarterback. They don't have those things coming back here this year that, I've kind of compared them to, like, say, 2020 LSU, a team that coming off a national championship sort of fell apart the following year. I think that's at least partially in play for Michigan. Now, they do bring back a lot defensively, so perhaps that keeps them in games. But if we're looking at kind of a team on the national landscape that has a chance of being preseason top 10, they could also be unranked by the end of the year, I would have to put Michigan in that potential category, at least for me. And in the SEC, I don't think this is going to happen. But, I would ask some questions about Missouri a little bit, because Missouri is going to be preseason top 10. And we've said some nice things about Eli Drinkwitz as of late. This isn't us saying, they're going to be a flop, they're totally overrated. That's not what we're saying. But if it goes wrong for anybody in the SEC, it's a team that had great success a year ago and now kind of finds itself needing to replace a lot of that for this year. We talked about Schrader, the running back, just the other day. But there's a lot of, let me go to the transfer portal to replace guys we also got out of the transfer portal. And sometimes there's a little bit of a trip up in all of that. Sometimes when you're not leaning on players you've had for 3 and 4 years, that doesn't always go super smoothly. Now, maybe you could say the same thing about Ole Miss. That's fine, but we're talking about Missouri on this particular topic right now. I don't think that's going to happen for Missouri. I don't think they're going to be a total flop. But of these teams we have near the top of the SEC, and there are 5 of them right now, Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss, Alabama, Missouri, of those 5, almost certainly someone from that group is going to completely disappoint. Almost certainly someone's going to be a massive disappointment. Now, well, it's going to be Alabama and first-year coach Kalen DeBoer. Maybe that's the case. But the point is we may not be able to completely predict who it is, but just the odds of, recent history suggests at least somebody is. And so, just be on the lookout for that, whether it be in the SEC or nationally. Somebody ranked in the preseason top 10 is probably due to be a massive disappointment. Kind of fun to discuss perhaps who that might end up being. I was going to do another thing on the kind of the playoff chase. I may save that for tomorrow about some of those non-SEC teams that I think are generating some conversation here right now. I think we've done enough for now. Let me make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And a great new partner of ours that we've had on the show here the last couple of weeks that I've loved telling the story for. I'm excited to remind you about one more time. It's our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners, and I love the word they have in their name, that's safe, because when it comes to your retirement, listen, you may like gambling on college football games and things like that, but you don't want to gamble with your future. And as you get closer and closer to retirement, the idea of something that feels safe and something that feels secure, I think that becomes more and more important. It just sort of stands to reason. When you're young and you don't have kids or maybe you're not married yet, hey, taking a few financial risks here and there, probably not a bad thing to do. But the older you get, the longer your life goes, the less some of that stuff starts to make sense. And so that's where our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners come in. They want to give you the comfortable retirement that you deserve, and they want to do that with a truly free, no-obligation retirement planning service conversation they want to have there with you, which includes no upfront risk to you, which is a really nice thing, and provides you the peace of mind you need knowing that your financial future can be secure and it can be safe. That's what Georgia Safe Retirement Planners are all about. So please find them online. It's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. That's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. All right, as we say goodbye to you here today, in lieu of a normal golden shoe, a lot of times we like to do something kind of funny on the way out the door. Today we're not going to do that, but we are going to do something that I think is important, and I think it ought to make you feel good as we get ready to say goodbye here today. Perhaps you saw the story in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The journey that former Georgia staffer Scott Cochran has been on. After stepping away from Georgia football because of battle with addiction and being in the recovery process the last couple of years, he's now away from UGA. But as the AJC has reported, that he's getting ready to start an addiction recovery group. The headline was, former UGA football coach opens up about his addiction and his plans for the future. After his unexplained departure from the Bulldog staff earlier this year, former special teams coach Scott Cochran seeks to help others with new addiction recovery group. The story itself goes into more detail about just how involved in all this that Scott Cochran is. We're so happy to hear this. What an amazing recovery journey Scott's been on here, and obviously that's ongoing for him. We continue to keep him in his prayers as he does that, and now seeks to help other people who are going through the same thing. What a powerful platform he has to do all those things. So we certainly wish Scott Cochran well on that. Perhaps a happy ending to a story that certainly took a lot of twists and turns over the years. But man, what an inspiring journey there for Scott Cochran. So you love to see that. Lousy Stinking Gators will give you a Gator Hater updater, 1,318 days. That's how long it's been since Florida has beaten Georgia in football. That is our Gator Hater updater. We like having fun with that. And, of course, we'll see all of you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. That is what R.S. Andrews is all about. All right, I want to get some comments here just for a moment. I'm on DawgNation.com right now, so I'll do a couple of those, and then we'll kind of move over and get the other platforms. DT says Missouri's going to miss that stud running back big time. Yeah, that's a guy that provided them a lot last year. And, it's just an example of the kinds of things that Missouri finds itself in need of replacing here again this year. Now, they also lose defensive coordinator. Their guy goes to LSU. What was his name? Blake Baker goes to LSU. So they're kind of missing that. But they got Drinkwitz. They got Cook coming back at quarterback. They got Luther Burden has a chance to be a big-time playmaker. I'm certainly not suggesting implosion, but if we're going to say somebody in the SEC that's sort of thought to be at that playoff level, somebody implodes, I mean, you certainly could understand why why Missouri would be mentioned in a conversation like that. Rambo says, I'm very happy to hear about Cochran's progress, but I wonder, I don't obviously, have anything, more to add on that, but I'm right there with you, Rambo, in terms of it's just nice to see the commitment to the journey that Cochran's been on. And it's one of those things where you got to imagine, for a guy like that, all these strength coaches are the same way. They're go, 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 go. Move. Constant forward energy. And when you have something going on in your personal life that has the potential to slow you down, in this particular case, you need to slow down because you need to deal with it. Like, how long would you go trying to pretend that it wasn't real, trying to pretend that it didn't exist? You got to imagine so often, it's like you just want to keep going. You just want to keep going. You just want to keep going. But the thing, in this case, the addiction, is eventually going to cause you not to be able to go at all. It has the potential to end your life. You have to stop and pay attention to it. But stopping is so, antithetical to what guys like this are all about. It's easy to, I think, kind of get a picture in your mind of what that must have looked like for him, and courageous to kind of battle through all of that. Let me go to YouTube here for a moment. And as I said before, hope everybody's doing well today. On the YouTube side of things, Jonathan Aaron says top 3 coaches there on the hot seat. Well, in the SEC, I think you get to 2 pretty quick. One of these we're glad about, one of these we're not. Billy Napier for Florida, of course. I would say that Sam Pittman for Arkansas is right in there, too. Nationally, the biggest hot seat coach, perhaps outside the SEC, is probably, at a certain point in time, I don't know if this counts as hot seat, but guys like Ryan Day and James Franklin both, I think the 12-team playoff could be a real problem for James Franklin because, they never beat anybody of note, but for the most part, the only 2 games they play where they have a chance to do that are Michigan, Ohio State. And so there's not really an opportunity for Penn State to get the signature win that James Franklin doesn't currently have. But now the 12-team playoff, more games matter, which if you're a guy like Franklin that doesn't seem to win the big games, it's just more of an opportunity for you to disappoint. So I would say that nationally you have to sort of put them in that category. I think that we talked about Lincoln Riley and what they kind of did over the course of the last season, kind of falling apart. Once again, I don't know that USC's in a position to fire Lincoln Riley given his contract, but in terms of completely tarnishing his reputation to the point that it's hard to, reconstruct it, I think that Riley could have some of that. But as far as I guess you got to put Dabo Swinney in some of that too, although I don't think that he gets fired after this year. So in terms of guys that could be fired, it's obviously a Pittman, it's a Napier. In terms of coaches who could find themselves in some real trouble and perhaps have, a reputation kind of damaged to the point that it can't be completely reconstructed, that's where you get into a Dabo, a Franklin, a Day, and a Lincoln Riley. Could be a really big hot take year for some of the most well-known coaches kind of outside the SEC. Jay Shipe says that he's picking the opposite of whatever I pick on something. Well, listen, there's probably a good chance you end up being right about that. Probably that's the case. Baggins and friends, thank you very much. I did have a really good Father's Day. Pretty uneventful for us, as I said before. I said this to our First and 15 audience. I watched some U.S. Open with my son, watched a movie with my daughter. We were very laid back, very low-key, stayed indoors a lot yesterday because it was hot. So pretty low-key day, but very nice, very fun nonetheless. Let's see what else. Greg Hendrick says, as many cruises I take in a year, I hope I bought some stock in Royal Caribbean. Listen, I'd love to have some Royal Caribbean stock right now. Seems like that company's doing really well. Let us see what else. Frank Patterson pointing out something important. John mentioned losing to Tech in 2016, and Frank says that loss to Tech is one of the things that made Nick Chubb say he wanted to return for his senior year. And it's the foundation of what we have right now. Frank, that's such a good point. I'm glad you shared that. Such a good point. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on. Lance D said, who was the better almost quarterback? Was it JT Daniels or Jacob Eason? I think for me, it's JT Daniels. Like the one thing that somebody who knows a lot more about all this than I do, and I'll give him a lot of credit for this, somebody who kind of lives in this world on a regular basis, inside the college football world. When Jacob Eason was the most hyped up guy in the world, this guy told me, I don't think he'll ever be good because he's not accurate. And accuracy is the kind of thing you either have or you don't. And ultimately, that ended up just kind of being true, that Eason just wasn't accurate enough to be the kind of quarterback to live up to the kind of hype that he had around him at that time. And this dude called it when Eason was the biggest thing on the planet. I'll always remember that. Always remember that. Daniels, of course, had a little bit of an issue staying healthy. And ultimately, like JT's so smart. I mean, JT comes across a really smart guy. I don't know how, like we talked about Stetson Bennett, that willingness to kind of improvise late in the game. I don't know how relaxed JT was. The moment where you just sort of like relax and just sort of cut it loose. And I think that smart guys have a tendency to live in their own head a little bit. And I think that JT had a little bit of a tendency to live in his own head a little bit. And I think, not just at Georgia, but 4 schools that he attended. That's just some of what he did. JT, a lot of checkdowns. You go look at some of that at both West Virginia and Rice. It's a lot of, this is open, so I'm going to take it. This is open, so I'm going to take it. This is open, so I'm going to take it. And if you're not careful, that doesn't add up to very much. And I just think that JT probably during his career could have just cut it loose a little bit more. But I do think he was a better player than Jacob Eason was. I do. I think they were both kind of flawed quarterbacks, to be completely honest with you. But I do believe that JT was a better player than Eason was. Let's see what else. Jay Shipe says that Kirby won't pile points on to Clemson, but he should. I don't know that he won't. The last time they played in this game to begin the 2022 season, they scored 7 straight touchdowns against Oregon and beat Dan Lanning 49-0. So I don't know that it's true that Kirby won't do that. And it's what I said about Beck a little earlier ends up being true, that you're just sort of good early in the game and on early downs. You may pile up points without having to try to. Jonathan Aaron said, did you see the article about the Rams try to trade for Brock Bowers? No, I did not see that. That's interesting. I'll have to go look at that. I did see where who was it that was talking about Bowers the other day for the Raiders? Kind of funny. I did see the funny thing about Bowers the other day from somebody who said that. Let me go to Facebook for a moment. All right, on Facebook. We'll see what's on everybody's mind over here, and hope everybody's doing well today. Let us see. Kent Holcomb says, I'd love to see the Georgia Tech games become relevant again, but right now I don't see that happening. Yeah, that's interesting. I think some fans do feel that way. I think there's also a pocket of fans, like I said on Friday, that part of the reason why the game's not relevant anymore is because Georgia's now having so much more success. So from that standpoint, I think you can make a case that the rivalry not being relevant is for Georgia probably a pretty good thing. That at one point in time, I used to dream of seeing Georgia do to Tech what Tennessee would do to Vanderbilt. And I'd say now that's even more true. Like, actually, Vanderbilt's kind of, closed the gap against Tennessee some over the course of the last decade or so. But, now Georgia's dominance of Tech is every bit what Tennessee's dominance would have been in Vanderbilt. So I guess I'm a little different than some in that I think the absence of relevance for that rivalry for Georgia is actually a good thing. Matt Rugavina says, remember when we all freaked out that JT wouldn't be playing against Arkansas? Oh, how times have changed. Yeah, that's the 2020 season opener. And, yeah, I mean, it's obviously pretty amazing. I mean, not only that, I can remember when Stetson Bennett showed out against UAB. Remember this when, like, JT's not playing, Georgia decides to go with Bennett. Bennett has a record-setting day. I still remember the show we did after that game, and I kind of talked about how it was sort of a game that sort of lived in a parallel universe. This was still JT Daniels' team. It just Stetson Bennett happened to have a great game, and good for him. Even then, it didn't dawn on me what Bennett was about to be, and I was actually fairly pro-Bennett in the 2020 season. I mean, Georgia would have lost to Arkansas that day if not for Stetson. Georgia might have lost to Auburn and Tennessee that year if not for Stetson. That Stetson stepped up for Georgia at a time they otherwise would not have had a quarterback. Beck wasn't ready. DeJuan Mathis just wasn't that guy. JT somehow, some way wasn't playing. That if you didn't have Bennett, you wouldn't have had a quarterback at all. So I was pretty pro-Bennett in 2020. But even with that backstory, still didn't occur to me what was on tap for Georgia, after the Bennett performance. Just amazing. College football has a way of surprising you. That was certainly that. Let's see what else. Jacob O'Neill says half the playoff teams this year will be from the SEC. You can certainly get. I mean, there's a possibility of 4 at least. That'd be a third. So maybe who knows? Maybe who knows? Couple of other Facebook comments here. John Raphael Anthony says, when is the next DawgNation cruise? John, here's what I'll tell you. There could be something coming out on that very, very soon. Could be something coming on that very, very soon. And it could be maybe something I'm very proud to tell you about. We'll find out more about that. Let's see what else. Pete Williams mentioned Sears in here, or maybe it's Bill Sanders that mentioned. Yes, that's Bill Sanders that mentioned Sears. So there's only 4 Sears left. Is that right? Crazy to me to think. At one point in time, that was like the largest retailer in America, and I believe now there's only 4 Sears stores left. Pretty wild. Pretty wild indeed. Oh, yeah, Matt Rugavina says he was referring to the 2021 Arkansas game when JT was still dealing with the hurt lat. Yeah. I mean, look, Stetson's story is one in which when he kind of became the starter in 2020, he did so seemingly without getting very many practice reps because it does not seem like he was on Georgia's radar at all. And then in 2021, also kind of reemerged as a starter after once again not getting very many starter practice reps at all prior to that. I still don't think we've properly chronicled just how wild and unexpected all of that would have been. Rambo says that strength and conditioning coaches are the closest we have to year-round staff. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people sort of think of that strength coach as the head coach of the offseason because they're the guy that gets the unfettered access to communication with the players during this time of year. I think there is some truth to that. Low Country Dog, going back to what we started the show with, says, I'm so thankful all these national pundits are doubting the Dogs. The bulletin board and monitors must be full. So there you go, Low Country. That's fun. That's fun. Let me go back to YouTube. We'll get ready to wrap it up for today. Kenneth Holt predicts that Clemson will just not be able to keep up with Georgia on offense. And I think there's a chance that's probably true. I do. Lance D says, when it comes to nicknames, Brock is Brocktimus Prime, period. That's good, Lance. I love that. Paul Moon says, when it comes to bulletin board material, Kirby uses it better than anybody I've ever seen. I would say that's kind of true. Paul Moon mentioning the fact that one of the Ohio State quarterbacks, Devin Brown, wears number 33, which is a very weird quarterback number. Well, talking here about department stores and things like that. You know, I guess in some respects I'm just an old soul, I guess. But I still like, and I don't do it very much anymore because I don't have time. But, you know, if I was going to buy some clothes, I'd still go to the store and buy them. I just don't buy very much anymore. But when I do, like, I want to go try it on. And, you know, if I get a little time to kill and, you know, if I just want to kind of unwind a little bit, I still like walking through a mall. Like, it seems like some of that kind of stuff is kind of going away, but I still like that. Now, as I said before, maybe that just sort of shows you how old I am. But, like, I don't get any joy from, like, scrolling Amazon or, like, one of these shopping apps or even the store websites. I don't get a lot from that. Every now and then I'll do it. I do think it's kind of cool. Like Facebook and some of those, I don't do a ton on Facebook, but when you go to Facebook, like the ads they suggest for me are usually pretty applicable to me. I think they do a pretty good job with that. So I don't mind seeing those, but the act of shopping, I would still rather shop in store. I just would. So I guess I sort of root for the brick and mortar stores to make it because I still enjoy that. And, you know, not to get off topic, but the whole thing about like GameStop and the whole like meme stop thing and what's his name? Roaring Kitty and all that kind of stuff. Like part of the thing that fueled the GameStop deal was the fact that GameStop fans thought that the hedge funds had overstated the degree to which the people disliked going into stores because GameStop people do like going into stores. I think they're probably right about that. So I do think there's still a group of people out there that want to go, thumb through a bookstore, that want to go to GameStop, that, want to go, try on some clothes before we put them on and buy them. So I sort of still root for the brick and mortar stores a little bit, I guess. I hope they can find a way to kind of, reinvent themselves or whatever is required there in that particular instance. I hope that's the case. Paul Moon says he's been buying games digitally for years, which obviously a lot of people do, and that's kind of why my understanding is a lot of the hedge funds obviously bet big against GameStop and shorted the stock so much. But, what some of the GameStop diehards were saying is that there was still a culture of actually going in the store. The people that worked there were kind of knowledgeable about the games. There was an experience of going in the store that was enjoyable, even though it wasn't quite as convenient as obviously buying digitally. Somebody also mentioned the issues with Red Lobster. Yeah, I kind of followed that a little bit too. I have kind of followed some of that. Stick D is asking an interesting question. He says, who other than Bama has an all-time winning record against Georgia? Somebody mentioned LSU. That would be kind of an interesting thing to look at. Because like some of the ones that used to be close, obviously Georgia now has a pretty sizable advantage against Auburn. Florida for a while was cutting into Georgia's lead. Georgia's now kind of added back on that. That would be interesting to see who all has a winning record against Georgia all time. some of the teams they haven't played very much, perhaps, too. A Nature Gator says, I also love fake wrestling. As I've said many times, a couple of things. A, wrestling definitely isn't real. It's better than real. That's the thing. It's like, the fact that it's fake is what actually makes it better. That if it was real, it wouldn't be nearly as much fun as it is. And also, here's the other thing. There may have been a time in my life when I felt a need to kind of like, put on pretentious airs and pretend to be more sophisticated than I am. I can promise you, at this point in time, I just sort of am what I am. And if you're into, more sophisticated things than I am, good for you. If you're into less sophisticated things than I am, I got no beef with you either. I don't feel any need to pretend to like something I don't just so I can fit in better, or, pretend to dislike something I do like so that people won't think a certain kind of way about me. As you get older, you just get a little bit more comfortable in your own skin. At least I hope you do. For me, that's one of the things that's made getting older more enjoyable, is that I just don't worry about a lot of stuff that I used to worry about. I love that feeling. Bill Shirley says there was anything better than the WCW. So there's been a lot of documentaries about the downfall of WCW. Vice has got one right now. I watched a couple of episodes of that yesterday. Pretty interesting. I kind of enjoyed that. Pretty interesting stuff. DMart42 says any active head coaches with a winning record against Kirby. He says that Hugh Freeze is 1-1. Does anybody even come close to that? Malzahn beat Kirby once, but Kirby beat Malzahn many more times than that. Malzahn, of course, at UCF. Bowl game situations. But a lot of the guys, it's weird. So think about the coaches that have beaten Kirby. Like Tom Herman, is he unemployed right now? Dan Mullen unemployed. Nick Saban obviously retired. Kirby's only lost 15 games. I mean, that's what's wild. It's like there are, as has been pointed out, there are more first-round picks coming out of Georgia in the Kirby Smart era than there have been losses. 15 losses. Yeah, so thank you, Cody. So Tom Herman's at FAU. So that's a non-Power 5 guy that has an active win against Kirby. It's just really weird. Will Muschamp's got an active win against Kirby Smart, and he's an analyst now who's dedicated to watching his son play, which he should be. It's just weird. You look at Kirby Smart's only got 15 losses, and if you look at who the 15 are, it's kind of sort of a mixed bag. It's a handful of Nick Saban and a whole bunch of strange stuff other than that. Pretty wild. Let us get ready to go. All right. Ethan Collins pointing out, since 1997, Georgia's only got one losing season. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool, right? I mean, obviously, Georgia's having the kind of championship success now we feel like the program should have always had. But even before it was at a championship level, we didn't have a lot of terrible around here. 2010 wasn't very good. 96 wasn't very good. 93, 94, they weren't very good. But we didn't have a ton of terrible. Now, we had some heartbreaking losses. But in terms of, just can't even show my face in public type seasons, we didn't have a whole lot of those. Thankfully, anyway, I guess. All right. We're going to go for now. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They will get your air conditioning unit tuned up. It's hot right now, y'all. And if you have those upstairs AC units, they're really working hard. So get it tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Keep yourself cool all summer long. It's online at rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.